London, 1936. Picture this. Angry crowds and cobblestones flying. A line of police officers are trying to hold back this huge wave of protesters. This wasn't just some scene from like a gritty British drama. This was a real event, the Battle of Cable Street. It's become this symbol of resistance against, against fascism.
Yeah.
And so today we are diving deep into that world, the world of British fascism in the 1930s.
Right.
We're going to look at how a movement that really seemed like it was destined to just fade away actually found new life, attracted all sorts of different supporters, people you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
And we're going to see how this culminated in this showdown, the Battle of Cable Street.
Right.
Which has honestly become more myth than reality at this point.
Yeah, it's a period that's often overshadowed, I think, by what was happening in Germany at the time. But as we'll see, British fascism had its own unique characteristics and a leader whose story is both fascinating and honestly deeply disturbing.
And that leader, of course, was Oswald Mosley. But you know what? He wasn't always a fascist, was he? His journey is one of those twists and turns that makes you wonder, how did he become the face of a movement like this?
You're absolutely right. Mosley's story is one of shifting political allegiances and ambition and ultimately a descent into extremism. So, he started out as a member of parliament, first with the Conservative Party and then with the Labour Party.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he even held a cabinet position for a time.
So he was a really prominent figure in British politics.
He was, yeah.
What led him down this unconventional path, I guess you could say? What was it about the politics of the time that made fascism seem like a viable option for someone like him?
Well, you got to remember the 1920s and early 1930s. This was a time of, immense economic and social upheaval, not just in Britain, but all across Europe.
Okay.
The Great Depression that hit hard and unemployment was soaring. And there was this real sense of widespread disillusionment with all the traditional political parties. Mosley, like many others at the time, he got frustrated with what he saw as their inability to address the crisis.
So he felt like they weren't offering solutions, bold solutions?
Exactly. He was convinced that Britain needed a new system, a new way of doing things. So initially what he did was he formed his own party, the New Party.
Yep.
And they advocated for radical economic policies like protectionism, and large-scale public works programs. He was trying to capture that feeling of discontent and offer this vision of a strong, revitalized Britain.
But his new party didn't really take off, did it? What happened? Did people just they didn't buy into his vision?
Yeah, it struggled to gain widespread support. People saw his ideas as too radical, as too much of a departure from the way things were. So this failure coupled with his growing admiration for Mussolini's Italy, because, fascism was on the rise there.
Oh, right.
This seemed to push Mosley in an even more, a more extreme direction.
I see.
And then, in 1932, he took the leap and formed the British Union of Fascists.
The BUF.
The BUF, yeah.
Now, that's a name that definitely sends chills down your spine, knowing what we know now about fascism in other parts of Europe.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, at that time, those years were turbulent, and the BUF initially, they held these huge rallies.
They did, yeah.
And they were filling stadiums. Mm-hmm. They were attracting all sorts of people.
Yeah.
So what was it? What was the appeal? Who were these people drawn to Mosley's message?
That's the unsettling part. This wasn't just some fringe group of thugs. This was disillusioned workers, veterans who felt forgotten after World War I. You even had some members of the upper class who were drawn to Mosley's charisma and his promises of this national revival.
Interesting. So was he exploiting those anxieties, those existing anxieties and fears?
Oh, he was a master at that, tapping into those existing anxieties about the economy, anxieties about, Britain's place in the world. He was a captivating speaker.
So was it just that he was in the right place at the right time with the right message? Or was there something more to it?
Well, he was a master of rhetoric. He presented himself as a strong leader, somebody who could cut through all the bureaucracy and restore Britain to its former glory.
So he was appealing to a sense of nationalism.
Absolutely.
Promising to put British interests first.
Exactly. Make Britain great again, a phrase we've heard echoed in more recent times.
Yeah, of course, right.
And he was skillfully using propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
The BUF, they employed sophisticated marketing techniques, Posters, rallies, they even had their own newspaper.
Wow.
They understood the power of imagery, of symbolism.
And of course, their infamous black shirts. Those were designed to project an image of power and discipline, right? Almost like a paramilitary force, setting them apart from the other political parties at the time.
Exactly. The black shirts, they were modeled after Mussolini's black shirts in Italy. And they were meant to evoke this sense of strength, of authority. Think of it as a deliberate visual tactic, meant to intimidate their opponents and project an air of unwavering commitment.
And they actually had a paramilitary wing too,
Yeah.
right? A more organized, and potentially violent element within the BUF.
Yes, they did. The black shirts weren't just for show. They
Uh-huh.
were organized into units. They trained in drills and combat tactics. They were the muscle of the movement, responsible for security at rallies and unfortunately for clashes with opponents.
Clashes. So even in these early years when they were seemingly, they were on the rise, was there violence associated with the BUF?
Sadly, yes. Violence became a real defining characteristic of the BUF, and it ultimately, played a significant role in their decline.
So this is where we start to see that mask slip, right? That initial, veneer of respectability. It starts to crack as the true nature of the BUF becomes more apparent. Can you tell us more about those clashes, those early signs of violence? Where did they happen, and who were they targeting?
Well, the black shirts were notorious for their confrontations with political opponents, particularly communist and socialist groups. They would disrupt their meetings, intimidate their members, and engage in these street brawls.
So it sounds like they were trying to provoke a reaction, to create chaos,
Yeah.
and then present themselves as the only ones who could restore order.
You could definitely interpret it that way. They seemed to thrive on confrontation. They used it to garner attention and to portray themselves as the defenders of, what they considered true British values. And unfortunately, this tactic, it seemed to work, at least at first.
Mhm.
Their aggressive stance, it appealed to some who were disillusioned with the perceived weakness of the more established parties.
But wasn't there a point where this backfired? I'm thinking of the Olympia meeting in 1934.
Right.
That seemed to be a real turning point, a moment where the BUF's true nature uh, was exposed.
Absolutely. The Olympia meeting was it was a pivotal moment. It was a PR disaster that revealed the brutality at the heart of the BUF. You have this packed stadium in London, Mosley's delivering this fiery speech, and the crowd is riled up, and then chaos just erupts.
What happened?
The black shirts, in full view of everyone, they start attacking hecklers and protesters.
And we're not just talking about a few shoves or punches.
No.
We're talking organized beatings.
Oh, it was a shocking display of violence.
Oh, wow.
They beat people with clubs, with fists, anything they could get their hands on.
So this was the moment when the mask truly slipped.
Yeah.
Even some of Mosley's strongest supporters started to distance themselves.
Exactly. The Olympia meeting shattered this illusion that the BUF was this legitimate political movement.
Yeah.
It exposed them as a group willing to resort to violence to silence dissent. The press, who had initially given Mosley a platform, they turned on him. Public opinion shifted dramatically, and the BUF's membership, it began to decline.
A major setback for the BUF.
Yeah.
But they didn't disappear, did they?
No.
Mosley was resilient. So how did he try to regain momentum after that?
Well, he realized he needed a new strategy, a new way to tap into public anxieties, and that's where, unfortunately, the anti-Semitism comes in.
Anti-Semitism. Was that a prevalent sentiment in British society at the time, or was this something that Mosley brought to the forefront?
Well, anti-Semitism, it wasn't as dominant a force in British politics as it was in other parts of Europe, but it certainly existed. There were pre-existing prejudices, particularly in areas that had large Jewish populations.
And Mosley was willing to exploit this?
Sadly, yes. And you have to remember the context. This is also a time when Jewish refugees are fleeing Nazi Germany and seeking asylum in other countries, including Britain.
Right. So there's this influx of Jewish refugees.
Yeah.
And Mosley sees an opportunity to scapegoat them, to play on those existing prejudices.
Exactly. He starts to incorporate this increasingly overt anti-Semitic rhetoric into his speeches. He's blaming Jews for the economic crisis. He's accusing them of controlling international finance, and he's playing on those fears of foreigners taking jobs and undermining British culture.
So a classic case of scapegoating. finding someone to blame for these complex societal problems.
Precisely. It was a cynical tactic, but unfortunately a very effective one.
And this ultimately leads to the confrontation at Cable Street.
Yes. Mosley's growing anti-Semitism and his deliberate targeting of Jewish communities, this becomes a focal point for the BUF. And it culminates in their plan to march right through the heart of the East End,
Oh, wow.
a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, in October of 1936.
So this was a deliberate provocation designed to stoke fear and division.
Absolutely. It was a show of force intended to intimidate the Jewish community and rally support for the BUF. They wanted to make a statement to assert their dominance. But Mosley, he really underestimated the level of resistance he would face. This march, this act of aggression, it would backfire in a way that would forever shape the narrative of British fascism.
And that's where we get to the Battle of Cable Street, a moment often hailed as a heroic victory against fascism. But as you've hinted, the reality is, well, more complex.
Yeah, it's a story that's been romanticized over the years, and while it certainly represents a powerful moment of resistance, it's important to understand the full context, the complexities, and the unintended consequences of that day. So you have this planned march, right, by the BUF with thousands of them right through the heart of London's East End. Supposed to be like a show of force, but it really set off this huge wave of opposition.
Sounds like they totally underestimated the people they were targeting.
They did. You had anti-fascist groups, communists, trade unionists, local residents. They all came together to oppose the march, and of course the Jewish community itself right at the front. I mean, they saw this march for what it was, just a blatant attempt to intimidate.
So how did they show their resistance? Was it peaceful?
Yeah.
Or were things getting ready to boil over?
Well, there were definitely calls to ban the march altogether. You know, the argument was it was a clear provocation, a threat to public order.
Right.
But the government, they upheld the principle of free speech, even for, even for people spreading hateful ideas.
Right.
They did assign a large police force to escort the march, though. They hoped to prevent violence, I guess.
Yeah, but the people who were against the march, they were determined to make their voices heard, to show everyone that fascism was not going to be tolerated in their street.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't just going to stand by and watch the BUF march through their neighborhoods. They organized barricades, blocked off the streets with anything they could get their hands on, overturned carts, lumber, even furniture from their homes.
Wow.
And they were prepared to fight the BUF, the police, whoever, if they had to.
So this is where the actual clash happened, the Battle of Cable Street. Paint a picture for us. What actually happened?
It was chaotic, really tense. On the one hand, you had thousands of those BUF members, all in their black shirts, marching in formation, trying to keep some semblance of order, you know.
Yeah.
And on the other side, this massive, diverse crowd of anti-fascist protesters. We're talking tens of thousands, completely determined to stop them.
Just a head-on collision right there in the streets of London.
You could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
And it quickly turned violent. Now, it's often depicted as this, direct fight between the fascists and the anti-fascists, like something out of a movie. But the reality is it's a bit more, well, it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
Most of the fighting actually took place between the police, who were trying to, clear a way for the BUF march, and the anti-fascist protesters.
So the police were caught in the middle of this.
Yeah, they became the main target of the protesters' anger. People were throwing anything they could find, rocks, bricks, even rotten vegetables, you name it.
Wow.
There were even stories of women throwing marbles under the horses' hooves, hoping to cause a panic, disrupt those police lines.
Sounds dangerous.
It was. There were injuries on both sides, but thankfully no one died. But it was close. The police, they faced this huge resistance, and they couldn't secure a safe route for the BUF. So finally, they told Mosley to call off the march.
So the protesters, they won.
Well, in a way, yeah. They stopped the BUF from marching through the East End. So in that sense, it was a victory. They stood up, they disrupted their plans, and they sent a clear message that fascism wouldn't be tolerated in their community. And that's how it's remembered, this big moment when everyday people stood up to hate and won.
But you said earlier that it's more complex than that. What did you mean?
Yeah, well, the BUF had to retreat that day, but the story doesn't end there. And in some ways, you could say the Battle of Cable Street, it
Had to
backfired.
got it.
Well, it gave Mosley and the BUF all this publicity, the kind they wanted, and they managed to spin it so they looked like the victims, of this violent left-wing mob.
They really turned it around.
Oh, yeah, they used it to push their narrative that they were the real defenders of British values, of free speech against the forces of chaos and communism.
Hmm.
And you know what? They actually gained support after all that.
So this victory, it actually helped the BUF.
It did, in a way, yeah. And it's a reminder that even when they lose these extremist groups, they can find ways to manipulate things, twist the story to help their own agenda. The Battle of Cable Street, it almost became a recruiting tool for them. It was a symbol of their struggle against what they called an oppressive system.
This is getting a bit unsettling. So how did they exploit this? Did they just get bolder in their actions and their rhetoric?
Well, they definitely used the incident to get attention. They held these big rallies talking about the injustice of it all. They made themselves look like the victims of censorship and violence. They even used pictures of the clashes with the police to help their claims. And based on reports, from the London police, there was a noticeable increase in BUF membership in the weeks after cable stop.
Wow. So the violence, the confrontation, the publicity, it all worked in their favor.
It did, yeah. It's a classic example of what we now call the Streisand effect. When you try
Mm.
to suppress something, it often just makes it more visible. People talk about it more.
Right.
And the violence didn't just stop at Cable Street either. There were reports of more anti-Semitic attacks in the East End after that confrontation.
Yeah.
Jewish businesses, their homes, they were targeted.
That's awful. So the battle, which was meant to protect them, it made them more vulnerable.
It's a tragic irony. This event that was meant to stop fascism, it might have actually made it stronger, at least for a little while.
So if Cable Street didn't stop the BUF, what did? What led to their downfall?
Well, several things, actually. First, Mosley's his focus on anti-Semitism, it was a miscalculation.
Yeah.
It worked with some, but it turned off a lot of the British public. People saw through the hate, and they realized it was just a desperate attempt to scapegoat a minority group.
Okay. So effective short term, but not long term.
Exactly. And then you have the growing threat of war in Europe.
Uh-huh.
As things with Nazi Germany escalated, British society, they became more focused on that, that external threat. And they were less interested in Mosley and his brand of extremism.
And where did the BUF stand as this bigger conflict was looming? Did they side with Hitler?
Actually, they became advocates for peace.
A fascist movement arguing for peace. That seems, well, it's unexpected.
Yeah, it might seem strange, but it was a really smart tactic. They argued that Britain should appease Hitler, avoid war at all costs, and focus on domestic issues.
So they tried to appeal to that desire for peace that everyone had, especially after World War I.
Exactly, yeah. And they made the other parties, the Conservative and Labour parties, look like warmongers, eager to get Britain into another horrible, expensive war.
Right.
And this stance, it actually worked. It gained them some followers, especially among those who remembered World War I.
Yeah. So they were able to kind of rebrand themselves.
They did, and that combined with the fact that there was already this anti-war feeling in Britain, it helped to boost their numbers, at least for a while. They held rallies, under slogans like "Peace with Honor," things like that. They drew big crowds. It was a manipulation of public fears and anxieties, but it worked.
Really fascinating how they could change their message to fit the political situation.
Mm-hmm.
But war did break out. What happened to the BUF then?
Well, when Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, Mosley he kept pushing for peace. He even said that Britain could negotiate a separate peace with Germany.
Wow.
But as the war got worse and with Churchill becoming prime minister, the government's tolerance for dissent it just disappeared.
Churchill wasn't really known for his patience, especially with people he saw as threats.
Oh, absolutely not. He saw the BUF as a dangerous fifth column, something that could really hurt the war effort. So in 1940, using these defense regulations, the government they arrested hundreds of people they considered a threat to national security, and that included members of the BUF. Mosley himself, he was imprisoned along with a lot of his followers.
So that was the end of the BUF.
Pretty much, yeah. With their leader in prison and the country at war, the movement just lost all its momentum. There were still some fascist sympathizers out there, but the BUF, as an organized group, it was over.
A reminder that even the most, charismatic leaders, even the ones who can really exploit those social and political anxieties, they can be they can be brought down when things change and the government is determined.
Exactly. But the story of British fascism and how it still shows up in political discussions today, that's far from over.
We've been talking about Oswald Mosley and the BUF, a movement that really drew people in. And, some were totally against it, of course, but it ultimately it fell apart during World War II. But, putting a leader in prison, even someone like Mosley, doesn't really mean the whole ideology just vanishes.
Right. It's rarely that simple.
What happened to the BUF's supporters, and their ideas after the war? Did all that just fade away?
Well, the BUF was officially banned, so a lot of former members, they just kind of kept their heads down, tried to blend back in. Some of them, maybe they really did change their minds. Others, probably not so much, but they kept it to themselves. But the ideas themselves, that nationalism, the xenophobia, the authoritarianism, those things, they didn't disappear.
So they popped up somewhere else, maybe in new movements or political parties?
Yeah, in the years after the war, you started seeing these little splinter groups and publications that kept some of those BUF ideas going. A lot of it focused on fears about immigration and how British culture was changing.
So they were latching on to those anxieties, those anxieties about a changing Britain, about Britain's place in the world after the war.
Exactly. Britain went through some huge changes in the decades after the war.
Yeah.
Immigration from former colonies, changes in the economy, the rise of the welfare state. And these groups, they found ways to twist that, to make it seem like British identity was being lost, like traditional values were being eroded.
And it's interesting, we've talked about this a bit, how some of the things the BUF said even decades ago sound a lot like what we hear in politics today, both in Britain and in other countries.
That's the part that's, well, it's unsettling, the economic nationalism, the blaming of outsiders, for society's problems, the promises to go back to a greater past, those ideas. They never really went away. They've been repackaged by different political groups, often on the fringes, but sometimes they creep into the mainstream.
It's a reminder that we can't let our guard down, that we have to recognize these patterns, these ways of talking, so that so we're not surprised when they come back in different forms.
Right. It's about understanding why people are drawn to these messages, these simple answers to complicated problems.
This brings up, I think, the biggest question. What can we actually learn from this part of British history? Why should we care about a movement that didn't even succeed?
The story of the BUF, even though it failed, it's a warning. It shows us that even in a democracy like Britain, these extremist ideas, they can take advantage of people's anxieties, gain a foothold, and even for a while seem respectable. And they can attract all sorts of people you might not expect.
So it's not about just, condemning the past. It's about figuring out how it happened, seeing the warning signs so we can stop it from happening again.
Exactly. When we study movements like the BUF, when we understand how they gained support, how they used language to exploit anxieties, then we're better equipped to see those same things happening today and challenge them.
So it's like we're protecting ourselves from those dangerous ideas. We're becoming more aware of how they can get into our societies, our political discussions.
Exactly. We have to be critical of the information we see, to question those simple stories and to really engage in thoughtful discussions, even when they're tough. We have to be willing to challenge people who are spreading hate and trying to divide us, no matter how tempting their message might sound.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into British fascism and the Battle of Cable Street, I think we leave our listeners with this thought. What are the anxieties, the fears, the things that divide us in our own society that might make us vulnerable to those extremist ideas, and what can we all do as individuals and as a community to address those issues, to build a stronger, more inclusive and well-informed society?
It's a good question to think about, a challenge for all of us. History might not, repeat itself exactly, but it often comes back around in different ways. And as we deal with the complexities of the 21st century, it's really important that we pay attention to those echoes of the past. And